A very warm welcome to you to the very first session of the 2021 annual conference of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. My name is Helen Paynter. I'm the founding director of the Centre. The Centre was established in 2019. We had a service yesterday. I told everyone it was 3 years old. I think I slightly exaggerated. It was a little over 2 years old. Founded it in 2019, originally to look at questions of the interpretation of biblical violence. So that's still very much one of the main focuses of the Centre. But as we've grown and developed, we've developed a second wing, and really tonight's session falls very much in that second wing, and that's looking at the use and abuse of the Bible in a violent world. We are proud to work with people of all faiths or with no faith. We are at core a Christian centre, but one of our core values is to have irenic dialogue with people who share our faith and who don't share our faith. We are an ecumenical organisation, and we work with, as I say, with a broad spectrum of people. I think that's something that characterises tonight's conference and future events this week that are coming up. I'm going to let Michael, who's hosting, introduce our speakers in a few minutes properly. I'm going to introduce Michael. Michael Spalione is one of the research associates of the Centre. He's been with us almost since the very beginning. He and I have been co-editing some books, and he's contributed to podcasts and all sorts of things. I'm delighted that Michael's going to be hosting the event tonight, and I'm in fact, just going to let some more people in. Excuse me. Perhaps those who are co-hosting, just keep an eye on that as well. That'd be great. Where was I? I was introducing Michael, wasn't I? So I'm delighted that he's going to be co-hosting. He's going to be hosting this evening, and I'm just going to sit back and relax in a minute and let him get on with it. I'm thrilled that Dr. Mathew Feldman is going to be giving our keynote address in a few minutes. Mathew and I have worked together for the last year or so. We did some podcasts together. We've become firm friends, and I'm thrilled that he's going to be addressing us. I'm also delighted that we're going to be having papers from Aaron Woods, from Lewis Ndekha, and from Maria Power. So I think it's going to be a fascinating evening. If you are users of Twitter, then we'd love it if you would live tweet the event. Please use, in fact, I'll pop it in the chat in a moment. Please use the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence tag there at CS Bible Violence, and the hashtag for this event is hashtag CSBVCon21, and we'll put that in the chat, or perhaps Michael will put that in the chat. One more thing to do before we kick off. We are very aware that the sorts of things that we talk about on a daily basis and the sorts of things that we're going to be talking about tonight and this week are not academic questions solely. They are questions to do with real people who experience real violence. And so whenever we gather for an event like this, we want to acknowledge that and to remember that. And so what we'll do is because I appreciate that we have a range of faiths in the room, and I don't want to assume that it would be appropriate to lead us in Christian prayer. But what I will do is I will light a candle, and I will invite us just to keep silence for about 30 seconds, just as we remember those who experience violence or the threat of violence, both in the present time or in the past. So I will do that now, and then I'm going to pop it over there where it'll be, I think, visible for the rest of the evening. I'm going to hand over to Michael now. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here. We are in for a treat. There are 4 very good papers that we will be hearing. Big picture, we're going to do our keynote first. So Mathew Feldman will give the first paper, and then we'll take a short break, just like a rehydrate bathroom break, like a 5-minute thing. And when we come back, we'll have a paper, the 3 papers that remain from Aaron Woods, Louis Ndekha, and Maria Power. I want to first introduce Mathew Feldman. Professor Mathew Feldman is the director of the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. Having written widely on the subject, Professor Feldman has long researched and published on the interaction between politics and faith in the modern world, especially on fascist ideology and the far right in Europe and the United States. Previously holding fellowships at the University of Bergen, Norway, Birmingham, UK, and Oxford 3 times actually. He is emeritus professor in the history of modern ideas at Teesside University and visiting professor at Richmond, the American University of London. Professor Feldman will be presenting a paper entitled From Christian Witness to Christianism, Thomas Merton, Ideology and Religious Violence. I'm based out of Louisville, Kentucky, and Louisville, Kentucky is very close to where Thomas Merton, who around here is a local hero, was a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane. He was an important figure, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the way that his thought is developed by Professor Feldman. Just a little bit of context about Thomas Merton. He died in 1968, but prior to his death, he was a very prolific writer, including his best-selling autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain. The Trappist monk, theologian, mystic, poet, and social activist. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Feldman, and let's all, I guess we can't clap, but we're going to show our appreciation with smiles. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. How is that coming through? Is that visible?
Looks good. I can see it.
That's the first success then, because I'm not exactly a technophile. So I'm going to just dive right in because I know that time is a little bit short for this whole session. So I'll start just by saying it was 60 years ago this month that Thomas Merton entered history as a social and cultural critic. In the words of one biographer, this period dawned with the realization, quote, that the time had come to move from the role of bystander, guilty by association and silence, to that of declared witness. Now, for allowing me to recount what feels urgent here with you today, I'm grateful to Michael and to Helen for hosting me and to all of you for auditing it. And I should say, by auditing, alas, many of these quotations, as you can see on your screen, are going to have to rather speak for me to make sure that I get all my comments in the sort of 45 or 50 minutes that we have together. Now, having you all here gives me some courage in following Dr. Paynter and Dr. Valerie Hobbs's lead in calling out injustice within and to do some witnessing of my own in the second part of this paper. But I get ahead of myself. So first, before training my focus upon the virus of what I'll call Christianism in the second part of this talk, I'd like to return to Merton's new thought in the civil rights era, which might be neatly summarized in Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorable observation that when machines, there we are, sorry, I'm actually gonna, can you still see that all right? Good, sorry. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, there can be no doubt each of these themes animated Merton across the 1960s. Yet it was recent history, both personal and political, driving what he called an obligation to stand up and be counted. There you can see a quotation from a letter of 1961 that ends, "Our faith can no longer merely serve as a happiness pill." First, briefly then, the personal history. The end of the 1950s concluded what Michael Mott has called Merton's, quote, stability crises, which led him to therapy, the Mount Purgatory in Mott's telling of considering relocating to Cuernavaca, Mexico, the picturesque setting for Malcolm Lowry's modernist marvel under the volcano. All of these changes driven in no small measure by the on-again, off-again issues of authority, obedience, and duty, with his Trappist order so exemplified for Merton in the issue of censorship. By the end of 1960, this psychological withdrawal was vitiated by the physical withdrawal he was permitted to exercise for a few hours a day, less than a mile from his abbey at what he termed his hermitage. And it should be noted that it was not until 5 years later that he was actually allowed to move in sort of full-time at this hermitage. So a monk living a vow of silence, but with too much to say, is yet one of the paradoxes that Merton recognized in himself, and which quite possibly underwrote his vast body of writing. He confessed that my life is almost totally paradoxical in what he wrote, in what another biographer called a humble and honest statement that was deeply revealing of Merton's innermost self. He continued, it is in the paradox itself, the paradox which was and still is a source of insecurity, that I have come to find the greatest security. Someone so complicated and so prone to confusion and self-defeat could hardly survive for long without special mercy. Having entered the monastery at Gethsemane in rural Kentucky on the very day war was declared with Nazi Germany, that's the 10th of December, 1941, the ensuing 20 years had largely seen the vast bulk of his output, both poetic and prose, dedicated to Catholic spiritualism, the priestly vocation, and, quote, total detachment from the world. This was soon to change markedly, described by another biographer, Monica Furlong, as, quote, an extraordinary interchange which had turned him outward, facing the problems of the world instead of inward to the concerns of the monastery. Paradoxically enough, or fittingly and paradoxically enough, his chief political work at the time of entering the Trappist order only appeared in the month of his death in December 1968. My Argument with the Gestapo, a macaronic journal, remains a neglected work in Merton's canon, powered by what I've called elsewhere, following Lewis Sass's characterization of late modernism in D.H. Lawrence and Wyndham Lewis, as an aesthetic of deadness. The modernist character in My Argument with the Gestapo observes in this novel, and I use the term loosely, not least as the main character who travels to occupied France is named Tom Merton, sharing the same birthplace and birthday. The main character notes that, quote, men become objects and not persons amongst the Nazis. Now you complain that because there is a war, but war is the proper state for a world in which men are a series of numbered bodies. Lying 20 years dormant unpublished, this aesthetic of deadness inspired a return to Merton's Catholic modernism in two quite extraordinary poems of 1961, both of them dealing with World War II, and both, I should say, quite upsetting, so please be warned. It opened a year of really extraordinary questioning and reorienting of Merton's fundamental thought, which coincided closely with the establishment and deliberations of the Second Vatican Council, which formally opened in October 1962. Quite unusually for a monk, and even more so for a Trappist novice master, it was history in the more familiar sense that impelled Merton to enter history himself. In May 1961, Merton was reading William Shirer's masterpiece, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He was disturbed greatly by this work, just as he was by the ongoing Eichmann trial in Israel between April and December of that year, revealing, quote, the obedient, loyal, and sane Adolf Eichmann before a horrified world, but also crucially, quote, the massacre of European Jewry and the almost total failure of Christians to prevent this. This in question is depicted forcefully in Merton's astonishing poem called Chant to be Used in Processes Around a Site with Furnaces. It appeared in the first publication of radical ecology ever published, the Journal for Protection of All Living Things, edited by the renowned beat poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. It is narrated from the perspective of Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau until 1943. It starts, quote, or an early stanza says, quote, "I was born into a Catholic family, but as these people were not going to need a priest, I did not become a priest. I installed a perfectly good machine. It gave satisfaction to many. I had obeyed perfectly." Now, to my knowledge, the direct literal indebtedness of Shira's masterpiece has yet to be identified in the first of Merton's anti-poems. And you can see the overlap here in parts that I've bolded. To the left, the chant, and to the right, William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I'll just pause over one, which actually happens to be a myth. It bears noting that the truth of what happened in Auschwitz-Birkenau is horrifying enough, but there wasn't actually fat made of human bodies or fat used from human bodies to make soap. But as you can see here, 12 pounds fat, 10 quarts water, 8 ounces to a pound is veritably word for word, including the caustic soda. In fact, virtually the entirety of chant to be used in processes around a site with furnaces can be sourced to the section The Extermination Camps on pages 870 to 876 in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, save the final stanza. This moves from recent history to Merton's present, which, though written in May 1961, is no less present in May 2021. Do not think yourself better because you burn up friends and enemies with long-range missiles without ever seeing what you have done. Quickly following his return to this aesthetic of deadness that characterized his work before he entered the priesthood in 1941, Merton then wrote 41 stanzas comprising Original Child Bomb, the name for the weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, termed by the Japanese, also in 1961, which narrates the onset of the nuclear age, drawing upon distinctly Christian terminology. For example, the atomic tests in the poem, the atomic tests in the New Mexico desert were called in the poem, and indeed during the war, Trinity, while, quote, "many who saw the experiment expressed their satisfaction in religious language, including a semi-official report quoting the New Testament, 'Help my unbelief.'" Thus, overseeing the Manhattan Project, Admiral Leahy was a doubting Thomas regarding the power of the bombs. Leahy was only convinced after the bombers returned to the papacy, namely the aircraft hangar on the island of Tinian, housing the notorious Enola Gay, the bomber. The sequence concludes with Merton denouncing the abrogation of responsibility for what, and I personally share Merton's sentiments here, remains today the best bet to end human civilization at its own hand, nuclear annihilation. And these are the final two stanzas. As to the original child that was now born, President Truman summed up the philosophy of the situation in a few words. "We found the bomb," he said, "and we used it. Since that summer, many other bombs have been found. What is going to happen?" At the time of writing, after a season of brisk speculation, men seem to be fatigued by the whole question. With these prose poems, in 1961, the levee was truly and publicly burst with respect to Merton's social criticism and human rights activism on, quote, "the problems of the world in the 1960s, the problems of war, of nuclear weapons, of racial conflict, and even of environmental pollution." Many have any of these problems been solved in the past 3 generations? And perhaps more to the point, the final 2 stanzas of Original Child Bomb, I think, provide an insight to the task Merton had set himself over what was to be his final 7 years on Earth, challenging the amorality of technology and the simulacrum of truth it creates in humanity, the fatigue of a post-Christian world in face of persisting militarism and racism, and above all, the loss of the language of fraternal love with which to express opposition to the world, yet crucially, while also being part of the world, and doing this in distinctly Christian terms. I propose to treat these issues briefly in turn in the period of Merton's own intellectual turn after May 1961, before a longer final section on perhaps the most loveless feature of all today, which is yet to be given a proper name: Christianism. Now, writing to the famed psychoanalyst Erich Fromm at the end of 1961, Merton confessed, "I am more and more baffled by the mystery of this great insidious force that has the whole world by the neck and is forcing it underwater in spite of all its good and self-preservative reactions." He later came to dub this mysterious force in the modern world simulacrum, a mask-like deceptiveness, he called it, of intellectual cheating, of an ideological shell game. For him, this was exemplified in the Catholic notion, much bandied about at the time, that any nuclear conflict could ever constitute a just war. Merton notes that the term simulacrum is translated as idols in 1 John, before contending that, quote, "we live in a society which is par excellence that of the simulacrum. We are the champion idolaters of all history. We are all the more inclined to idolatry because we imagine that we are," Merton continued, quote, "of all generations, the most enlightened, the most objective, the most scientific, the most progressive, and the most humane." Long before the rise of The End of the History and The Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, let alone the social media hellscape that too often many see today, Merton decried this image which is false and is also the object of a cult. We worship ourselves in this image. Now, what I've tried to express thus far here is that Merton's final years were marked by increasingly active social critique, but it was not simply the inverse of his introspection between 1941 and 1961, which might be understood as a cloistered calling out of heresies in the contemporary world. Instead, Merton's foray into contemporary inauthenticity, ecumenicalism, nuclear disarmament, civil rights, the Vietnam War, and even environmentalism all stem from the same concern, to borrow Martin Luther King's language yet again, that the church had been a tail light rather than a headlight. Or put another way, that stable ecclesiastical foundations over centuries had in fact led to a moral ossification, that the hubris of the church had too readily accepted the materialist logic of the world in exchange for political influence and an easy ride. In its place, Merton believed, needed to be, quote, "a theology of love that must seek to deal realistically with the evil and injustice in the world and not merely compromise with them." This world of compromise, contended Merton, or at least what he understood as Christendom, had helped it to become post-Christian. Now, the term is C.S. Lewis's, but he uses it in a particular way. A theology of resistance was demanded in unprecedented times. Enemies of a secular apocalypse and the institutions that suborned it, even within the church itself, espoused, quote, "a totally inadequate notion of sin, which was and still is popular amongst Christians who have not really understood their religion." It was this view, as much as anything, that led to Merton's ban on political writing in April 1962, amidst the preparations for Vatican II, and mere days ahead of the planned publication of his text, Peace in the Post-Christian Era. Indeed, claims his publisher Naomi Burton from New Directions, quote, "the term post-Christian could be seen as the philosophic nexus of Merton's turn to the world in the 1960s. Unlike C.S. Lewis, however, Merton characterized post-Christianism less as a kind of sociological, even theological category, than as, quote, "a mind which is no longer Christian but is still self-conscious about it and still concerned with vestiges of Christian thinking." Riffing on Albert Camus a bit, who he closely read at this point, Merton understood this as, quote, "the unbelief of believers, mired in what he called the humdrum pathology of everyday life. Romantic individualism, nationalism, progress, and a hope that claims to be Christian, sanctioned by certain supposedly ethical Christian norms. In reality, this was merely a despiritualized Christianity, quote, "a Christianity that claims to obey God when in fact it is obeying only the imperatives of a marketing and affluent society." Largely kept out of this affluence in the US, of course, are Americans of color, first in chattel slavery, then via Jim Crow laws, and some 4,400 lynchings since the Civil War, all of which are horrifically captured in the attack on Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, exactly a century ago. Here, too, Merton felt that too many churches were, quote, part of the establishment that must now patiently suffer the consequences of past indecision, blindness, and evasion. But then again, if all Merton offered was fatalism and resignation, his religion and race in the United States would not speak as lucidly to our present as it does. For this would imply a denial of Black American agency and, yes, of the possibility for improvement. Instead, quote, the problem of American racism turned out to be far deeper, far more stubborn, infinitely more complex, with equal rights that have been granted to him only on paper and too late. Indeed, 60 years on reads the lead in The Economist's expose only this week, any one of thousands of texts can bear this out. Black Americans are, quote, poorer, less likely to own homes, and more likely to be imprisoned than whites. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered last year, quote, a Black child born poor here 35 years ago would live today in a household where the average income is just 17,000 pounds. The number is a bit lower for boys, slightly higher for girls. Also across the country, quote, rates of Black home ownership in 2021 are lower than rates of white home ownership were in 1870. This outrageous state of affairs leads The Economist to conclude, quote, that all but the most determined pessimists would concede that racism has declined since Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. So why? Why have the life prospects of African Americans, particularly men, stopped improving? The question, of course, is no less pressing in Britain and Western Europe today. But to this, Merton responded in 1964 that we, and by that I think he meant white Christians, quote, are not a special kind of privileged being with the right to judge everyone and decide everything for everybody. Instead, the cries for recognition by our brothers and sisters whose skin pigmentation may be different, quote, offers the American Christian a chance to face reality about himself and recover his fidelity to Christian truth, not merely in institutional loyalties and doctrinal orthodoxies, but in recanting a more basic heresy, the loss of that Christian sense which sees every other man as Christ and treats him as Christ. The end of this section cites 1 John 3:16 to 18 and specifically underlies the phrase, let us put our love not into words or into talk, but into deeds and make it real. In his final journals, Merton wrote of the painfulness of interchange, which I think also relates to his views on racial justice. Those who have never been impelled to change externally must, as a matter of conscience, lift up those who have been denied stability and denied the full fruits of equality. That challenge also remains with us today. In his final reckoning, not just with justice, but with the very iniquities he found in himself, the concept that Merton comes to advocate is parousia. His first use of the term in 1961 is strictly theological, understood as, quote, free discourse between God and man. By 1963, reflecting on the liturgical changes of Vatican II, Merton characterized parousia as the language of fidelity within the church. Yet in his final years, specifically 64 to 67, Merton characterized parousia as the language of fidelity, yet in his final years, the term was brought still further down from the heavens to the earth in order to denote Christian witness, quote, between opponents, inside the church and outside. It is not that I empathize with your problems, Merton wrote, and still less that I sympathize them. No, parousia means that your problems are my problems. Somehow fittingly, the term only takes its full form in one of Merton's final essays, which only appeared after his death. And I'm referring to War and the Crisis of Language. In this essay, Merton asserts that ordinary modes of communication have broken down into banality and deception, as in the language of advertisement, quote, beyond debate and beyond reason, at once totally trivial and totally definitive. Here the poet, the priest, and the social critic finally speak as one person. Quote, race riots and assassination are also symptoms of the same illness, while they are also, and this is more important, he says, a kind of universal language. Turning to war, Merton lands on the infamous phrase uttered outside Ben Tre in Vietnam on the 7th of February, 1968. It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Here we see again, Merton writes, an insatiable appetite for the tautological, the definitive, the final. It is the same kind of language and logic that Hitler used for his notorious final solution. This red or dead language was going to be the end of us, Merton feared. It is the language of power. And that is the antithesis, he thought, of Christian witness, of what Jonathan Montaldo rightly dubs Merton's call for true speech. Quote, a free zone is now one in which anything that moves is assumed to be enemy and can be shot. Merton laments, quote, in any case, the language of escalation is the language of naked power. The language of escalation in its superb mixture of banality and apocalypse, science and unreason is the expression of a massive death wish. And he was reading Civilization and Its Discontents by Freud at this time. We can only hope that this death wish is only that of a decaying Western civilization and that is not common to the entire race. Yet the language itself is given universal currency by the mass media. It can quickly contaminate the thinking of everybody. Coming full circle, we find the triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are in fact one hydra-headed monster: domination, mastery, conquest. For conquest must be total. It is found in the everyday description of an opponent as, quote, at once so perverse and so irrational, such a psychopathic liar, in fact, that he has to be cleverly treated as a beast or a maniac. The fuel for such demonization is the language of force, of certainty, of assumption, and sometimes even of authority. It is a language in Merton's characterization of, quote, double talk, tautology, ambiguous cliche, self-righteous and doctrinaire pomposity, and pseudo-scientific jargon that mask a total callousness and moral insensitivity. Indeed, a basic contempt for man. And so, to appropriate a fitting phrase, what was to be done? It is here that Merton's parousia comes into its own in his final years. In rejecting the illness of political language, Christians cannot simply turn to its opposite, what Merton characterizes language of, quote, the guerrilla warrior, merely a new language that mocks the ponderous and self-important utterances of the establishment. Now, while Merton allows that this language is more in contact with relevant experience, the hard realities of poverty, brutality, vice, and resistance, and therefore, quote, a healthier and more concrete style of thought, it still remains the language of power, if not yet one of mastery. In exchange, in turn, instead, what is needed is parousia, truth-seeking speech, grounded in love for the other. Man does not, and this is another longer quote from Merton, man does not know himself fully, man does not fully know himself so long as he is isolated in his own individual selfhood. His identity comes to light only when it fully confronts the other. We are created for freedom, for the options and self-dedications implied by the highest kind of love. We discover and develop our freedom precisely by making those decisions which take us out of ourselves to meet others as they really are. Having made the discovery, we are ready for the love and service of others, unafraid of being wrong or of changing one's ways. And as Merton wrote in Note for Ave Maria only months before his death, to know how to de-escalate. This parousia afforded what Merton came to understand as a spiritual liberty, which he characterizes freedom from domination, freedom to live one's own spiritual life, freedom to seek the highest truth, unabashed by any human pressure or any collective demand, the ability to say one's own yes and one's own no, and not merely to echo the yes and the no of the state, party, corporation, army, or system. The language of humanistic change needs to be direct, I think Merton was contending, and it needs to be seen to hit its target to have any chance of impact. Merton's appeal to parousia then was a kind of last rites for humanity, a language of togetherness, of suture. He says, to choose the world is to choose to do the work I am capable of doing in collaboration with my brother, to make the world better, more free, more just, more livable, more human. And it has now become transparently obvious that mere automatic rejection of the world and contempt for the world, and I should pause here to say, I believe he's talking about himself during that 20-year period between 1941 and 1961, is not in fact a choice, but the evasion of a choice. The man who pretends that he can turn his back on Auschwitz or Vietnam and act as if they were not there is simply bluffing. Merton's late essay, Is the World a Problem?, captures this parousia of Christian love and the, quote, openness, freedom, the willingness to take risks that must be joined to what he called respect for the human person in the human community. It is, in fact, Merton concludes, quote, the great problem of our time, not to formulate clear answers to neat theoretical questions, but to tackle the self-destructive alienation of man in a society dedicated in theory to human values and in practice to the pursuit of power for its own sake. These can never be Christian values. Quote, it is only in assuming full responsibility for our world, for our lives, and for ourselves that we can really be said to live really for God. Now, I'm going to change gears a little bit. If you thought that one was depressing enough, wait until you hear the second part. With this Mertonian sentiment in mind, I now propose to shift, or better perhaps, to attest to something of an elephant in our global room: religiously inspired revolutionary political violence. On this topic for nearly 20 years now, scarcely a day has gone by without reportage on Islamism. The latter may remain in our global room, but no one, of course, can claim it's unseen. And that is, of course, with good reason. To take but one example, on 9/11, nearly 3,000 innocents were brutally murdered by violent jihadi Islamists in the worst sub-state terrorist attack in history. But there is something, I confess, that has long vexed me as a scholar and as a person of faith, in keeping with the New Testament injunction to take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I've referred to the phenomenon about which I'll address for more than a dozen years, but I've never really had a chance to properly delineate what I think is again becoming an urgent subject matter. And I'm just going to read you the top bit there, but I've had a sort of a occasion to refer to it in pieces in the media. Whereas religious politics, in a banal sense at least, may be observed wherever clerics become directly involved in politics, the term Christianism is intended to denote a more radical, revolutionary approach to secular politics. By Christianism, I mean a secular and this-worldly doctrine of salvation, which can be adopted by Christians and non-Christians alike, that is different from, alternatively, what some might call evangelicalism, political Christianity, fundamentalism, for reasons that I hope to clarify briefly. One scholar makes a similar claim about the distinction of Islamism from types of religious fundamentalism in the Muslim faith, like Salafism. This is a political ideology appropriating a religion and not the other way around. But I would go further than that scholar, Joas Wagemakers, in describing Islamism as a political application of Islam. Instead, I would suggest that both violent and nonviolent forms of Islamism in their very nature reject pluralism and advance a doctrine of supremacy that is the hallmark, the very hallmark of extremism, whether that extremism is ethnic or national or religious. It should scarcely need saying here amongst all of you, but Islamism is therefore an extremist perversion of one of our world's leading faiths. As a revolutionary ideology born, and I think this is crucial, of the 20th century, it can be directly traced to the interwar Muslim Brotherhood under Hassan al-Banna, for example, the doctrines after the war of Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, and later to the quasi-state terrorism of the Islamist death cult Daesh. For all its supposed medievalism, then, Islamism is in fact a product and not merely a rejection of modernity. And I should like to take a similar perspective here on Christianism, and in so doing, hopefully, take care to delineate my subject. So first, a banal point. Believers have politics, just as do non-believers. For this reason, I'm wary of constructions like political Christianity or political Islam. For the same reason, I'm only marginally less wary of constructions like apolitical Christianity or apolitical Islam. Though in the latter case, and this is why I'm marginally less wary of them, I accept, of course, that different forms of Hermeticism stretch across these faith traditions and, of course, others. Nor by Christianism do I mean a form of Christian nationalism that is evident in the contemporary US, although, of course, not only there. One might observe the heartbreaking scenes only last month of Protestant loyalists rioting in Belfast and its frightening implications for the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Or indeed, earlier, the conflict acting as the midwife for the long struggle over the 6 counties, the Great War. Throughout that conflict, scholars have clearly shown that both Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox confessions anointed or better armed their nations with justifications of a holy war. This is not contentious. Christian churches' injunctions to fight for God and nation is but one example of Christian nationalism. And of course, there are too many others like it in the Christian tradition as there are in other faith traditions. It is not new. The particular sense of Christian nationalism, likewise, has been extensively studied in the American context with particular focus on white evangelicals. So in the compelling empirical account, Taking America Back for God, for example, Whitehead and Perry conclude that, quote, those who embrace Christian nationalism insist that the Christian God formed, favors, and sustains the United States over and above the other nations in the world. It is in this sense that Rogers Brubaker has used the term Christianism in 2017, whereby, quote, Christianity is increasingly seen as their civilizational matrix and as the matrix of a whole series of more specific ideas, attitudes, and practices, including human rights, tolerance, gender equality, and support for gay rights. Yet here, too, I suspect we may be seeing a case of old wine in new bottles, with reactionary and even tribal expressions of a faith, in this case, Christianity, that seem to me more to belong to a tradition that, in American terms, at least, stretches from John Winthrop's 1630 City on a Hill to the televangelists of our day. Even when cast in such civilizational terms, these forms of Christian tribalism, as we might term them, are of a different stamp than the darker tradition I'm trying to identify here. The latter is first and foremost ideological and emerged between the wars to afflict all 3 principal confessions in Europe, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy. And you can see the first slide here of what I really am trying to talk about. I'm going to take an example from each of these confessions. I'm trying to press my case and to show how it's different than Christian nationalism or even tribalism. So first, let's start with Orthodoxy. This, you see a picture here of a Romanian Orthodox ideologue named Jan Mota, who is a key leader of militant fascist mystics in Romania called the Legion of Archangel Michael. Just before he was killed by Republicans in what he understood As a holy war and civil war, Spain, Mota declared, no force, no love exists which is higher than that of the race and can only be realized in the race, except for the force of Christ and love of him. We are defending Christianity in a foreign land. We are defending a force which wells up from the force of our people, and spurred on by our love for the cross, we are obeying here in Spain our love for the Romanian people. Underscoring that Mota's views were scarcely marginal, a mortuary train carried Mota's body from the Spanish battlefield, and also Vasily Marin, you can see on the bottom right there, literally from the Spanish battlefield right across Europe in winter 1937 to Bucharest, Romania, where he was received by literally hundreds of thousands of devotees lining the streets, later helping to nearly triple the Legion, or the what they're called the Iron Guards membership, to fully 272,000 people by the end of that year. Nor was this form of sacralized politics limited either to the laity or to Orthodox fascists. And I should pause here to say, much of what I've shown you has been upsetting. It's been genocidal even, but this is, to my mind, straight up heresy. So again, I apologize for the difficulty in what we're going to see. In Nazi Germany, the regime initially supported the mistitled German Christians as an expression of what the 24 of the NSDAP party program titled Positive Christianity. Under Reichsbishop Heinrich Müller, the German Christians promoted the Führerprinzip in Germany's Protestant churches, aiming for a complete coordination between a totalitarian state and a totalitarian church. A picture of what this was intended to look like can be glimpsed from these sections of Müller's quite evil 1934 rewriting of Christ's Sermon on the Mount. Just to give the first two examples, blessed are they who bear suffering, for they shall be confronted. That is mongered into benevolence to him who bears his suffering manfully. He will find the power to never doubt uncourageously. I say that unto you, you should not resist evil, but if anyone should strike you on the cheek, turn the other one also. I mean, a cornerstone of Christian values. This becomes, I say to you, it is better so to live with other members of your Volk, that you get along with each other. Volk community is a high and sacred trust for which you must make sacrifice. Therefore, come out to meet your opponent as far as you can before you completely fall out with him. And here's the real shocker of a line. If in his excitement your comrade hits you in the face, it is not always correct to hit him back. So far did this heresy go that the German Christians even sought, quote, liberation from the Old Testament with its cheap Jewish morality. That is, by literally trying to expunge the Old Testament from the Bible. The genocidal analog of this attempted erasure was the Holocaust itself, powered by what Saul Friedlander has aptly called redemptive anti-Semitism. Yet fighting a holy war against socialists in Spain or advocating genocide from the pulpit was not Christianist enough for the independent state of Croatia, the Catholic wartime ally of Nazi Germany under the rule of the Ustasha. The Ustasha methods of killing were in fact so brutal that even the Nazi plenipotentiary based there recoiled in horror. For instance, consider the words of the head of State Direction for Renewal on the 22nd of October 1941. In this country, only Croats may live from now on because it is a Croatian country. We know precisely what we will do with the people who do not convert. I have purged the whole surrounding area from babies to seniors. If it is necessary, I will do that here too, because today it is not a sin to kill even a 7-year-old child if it is standing in the way of our Ustasha movement. Do not believe that I could not take a machine gun in hand just because I wear priest's vestments. If it is necessary, I will eradicate everyone who is against the Ustasha. These words targeted not only demonized victims of Nazism, such as Jews and Roma and Sinti travelers, but also Orthodox Serbs, who were in fact the largest victims of the Ustasha policy of thirds. That policy of thirds was kill 1/3, expel 1/3, and forcibly convert 1/3 of their enemies. This sacrilege culminated in the only extermination camp not directly run by the Third Reich itself, called the Jasenovac death camp, less than 100 miles from Croatia's capital, Zagreb. Jasenovac, where some 100,000 ethnic or religious victims were brutally murdered, was in fact commanded by a serving priest. Though he was later defrocked and ultimately hanged in 1946, both his wartime actions and the escape of so many of his allies on the Catholic rat line to South America, which included his leader, the leader of the Ndekha, Ante Pavelic, who spent more than a dozen years hiding in Argentina after the war. All of this suggests that in much the same way that fascism could appeal to seduced conservatives, Christianism could also appeal to Christian tribalists. The case of such priests during the fascist era led to the heuristic term clerical fascism, characterized as a hybrid between the Christian faith and fascism, yet in a manner inverse to Christian nationalism, which can be entirely secular, shorn of biblical metaphysics. Clerical fascism suggests a phenomenon that is solely from and within Christian churches. With respect to Christianism in our arguably secularizing world, this would include self-described cultural Christians like Anders Breivik, the terrorist murderer of 77 innocents in Norway on the 22nd of July, 2011. His 775,000-word manifesto is clear on his secular appropriation of Christianity for the purposes of attacking cultural Marxism. So too with the civilizational claim adopted by conspiracist proponents of the Great Replacement, which alleges a Muslim plot to destroy Christian civilizations from within. The murderer of 51 Muslim worshippers at Friday prayers in New Zealand only 2 years ago was aimed at countering a so-called white genocide, itself a neo-Nazi term coined by the convinced race murderer David Lane, who is also notorious for popularizing the so-called 14 words, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children," the sort of neo-Nazi slogan of the 21st century. Like Breivik, the convicted terrorist Brenton Tarrant's 74-page manifesto, The Great Replacement, specifically addresses itself to Christians, ending, "Ask yourself, what would Pope Urban II do?" As many of you will know, Pope Urban declared the First Crusade in 1095, opening one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. This suggests to me that although modern and revolutionary, Christianism need not be defined via a theological stance. As it were, one can be agnostic on the issue of faith and still be a Christianist. More important, I think, is the functionalist Durkheimian religious behavior towards the sacred and the profane, which closely links the clerical fascist with the cultural Christians of Tarrant and Breivik's stripe. All of this leads me to define Christianism as, quote, a modern ideological appropriation of Christianity based upon a secular vision of redemption through political violence against perceived enemies. I'd like to think that the era of fascism has left Christianism in our bloody past, but cards on the table, this construction to me feels relevant again in the wake of the Capitol insurrection on 6 January 2021. True, heretics like Identity Christians, the Army of God, and many others besides have emerged since 1945. But these were tiny and fringe extremist movements. And frankly, that is not the case now, above all, with the QAnon movement. Is this not Christianism writ large? Now, as this final video, which I'm not going to actually play except for 30-second clip, has been already brilliantly covered by Drs. Hobbs and Paynter in a recent contribution to CSBV, I'd like to end, well, I'm going to give you 10 seconds of it, if that's all right, to give you the flavor.
Each of you will be a warrior for the truth. You'll be a warrior for our country and for your family. I know that each of you will do what is right, not what is the easy way. Our answer will be a rebirth of devotion to defeat the enemies of humanity. This is a very different administration than the United States has had in the past.
Now, I'd actually like to end on a rather happier note in returning to one of Merton's very final texts, which captures his call for proesia in a post-Christian and increasingly Christianist world. Grant us prudence in proportion to our power, wisdom in proportion to our science, humanness in proportion to our wealth and might, and blessed our earnest will to help all races and peoples to travel in friendship with us along the road to justice, liberty, and lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. For the Q&A time that we're going to have now, if you would type your questions into the chat box, you can either send them directly to me, Michael, or publicly. I will field them. To get the ball rolling, I have the first question. It's chair's right, I suppose. So you're working with this concept of Christianism, and you know, within my field of political theology, I think we're kind of both, you know, there's these terms like civil religion. We've got William Perry and Whitehead, who have recently thrown out the term Christian nationalism. Could you please delineate a little bit the difference between how you're using Christianism from, per se, the phenomenon of civil religion and Christian nationalism? That's part one of my question. Part two is, it sounds like to me, and please clarify this if I'm wrong, that Christianism has an inherently, it's a racialized notion. So I guess my question is, broadly speaking, how is Christianism different than civil religion and Christian nationalism? And then secondly, how does race kind of color it, and does it color it in a unique way? Thank you.
So I actually think the second part is a little bit more straightforward. I don't think that racialization is essential. Certainly it's a doctrine of supremacy, okay? And that supremacy is invariably going to be manifest in one way or another, which could be a kind of religious or even confessional supremacy. It would most usually be in a kind of racial supremacy, but I wouldn't even exclude the more extreme forms of, let's say, Marxist liberation theology as not putting a class in that supremacy kind of thing. So I don't want to foreclose the possibility that this isn't just something on the radical right. It could conceivably be on the radical left. I certainly think it's different than a civil religion, which is essentially, I think, the democratic, liberal democratic equivalent of what scholars of fascism called a political religion. Okay, so Robert Bellow, when he's talking about civil religion, says it's kind of the myths that make up the nation. I pledge allegiance to the flag, the kind of everyday stuff. Now, what I want to suggest is that if you put that on sort of steroids, you get Christian nationalism, or even at its extreme level, a kind of Christian tribalism. And whether we like it or not, Christian tribalism has been around as long as Christianity has been around. What I want to suggest that is different about this is that this is a heaven on earth revolutionary doctrine born of ideology. And I think ideology there is the wild card, which conceivably allows for transnationalization, can allow for different forms of absolutely unrestricted violence. Now, we have seen that before, but I do believe that what we looked at in some of those slides is a fundamentally different phenomenon than even the World War I sending troops to fight each other in a kind of holy war in Europe. That is the thing that has pockmarked Christianity throughout its history. And I want to suggest that Christianism is something new, and is something that can be exemplified in a way, not just by those awful slides past, but in what Dr. Paynter and Dr. Hobbs have shown in the transcript and in the write-up of that QAnon video, something that is essentially appropriative. Plenty of Christian nationalists were devout Christian believers. This is something different. It is appropriative in a secular way, even if it draws upon this Durkheimian functionalist view of religion. It is not based on, do you believe in the hereafter? It is based on how you behave towards the sacred. And the sacred in this case is nation, potentially class, ethnic group, and even confession, as we saw with the Eustacia.
Another question that's popped up. So Jürgen Moltmann has emphasized the importance of the horizon of hope in Christian theology. That shapes our entire orientation. So this eschatology, a horizon of hope, what would you say colors within within Christianism? What kind of colors the horizon of hope, if it's not, I guess, ideologically tied to Jesus?
I mean, in this case, I think it is a salvation that is earthly. It is an eschatology, if you want to use that term, of race, nation, class, where the utopia is graspable almost by definition if you purge or cleanse or get rid of these enemies. So it is only by defeat. Now, again, theoretically, that elimination can be, or conversion can be allowed, but it is only by the complete conquest and mastery over a demonized group that your utopia on earth is assured.
And regarding the QAnon phenomenon, this is something that you're pointing out from that last video that you're seeing here, is that it's this worldly view of salvation that salvation is dominion, inherently dominical. It's very control and
yeah, and to maybe take that point, because as Dr. Hobbs says, salvation that is earthly, I think that is absolutely essential. So we hear in that video, and people may wish to play it a little bit later, the Lord's Prayer is the concluding bit. But what are they targeting at? It's America being reborn, America being this. It's not a Lord's Prayer to save us from our souls. It is not a salvation that is otherworldly. It is America going to be reborn once you do all of these things, which of course the QAnon loons will tell you to do. And I think that is fundamentally different than even forms of Christian tribalism and Christian nationalism, which are to some extent still predicated on metaphysical belief, on that William Jamesian, are you actually a believer in your heart? And I think this is different. This is Durkheimian function towards the sacred.
I've got another question here. Brandon Brandon says, how likely is it for the church who espouses Christian nationalist beliefs to devolve into Christianism?
I think that is the great seduction. That is the great danger, is that once you start moving along that line, what we're seeing now, for example, are patriot churches in the US, which are literally blessing guns, for example. And so, yes, I think that once you slide along that line, you can get further and further from it. And all of the examples that I showed from the interwar period, that was a period of heightened, even revolutionary nationalism. And I think that was the seduction that was offered to priests who, by and large, were on the conservative side, even the far-right conservative side. They were the ones that were seduced into this Christianism, which made an absolute mockery of the faith.
Reading people like Robert Bella and others on civil religion, one thing that continually pops up in the literature is that the issue of how do you combat Christianism, civil religion, Christian nationalism? How do you go on offense, as it were? And I'm curious. I know that's a hard question to answer, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
I think we have to call it out first. And I mean, here I am a Mertonian. I think clear, unmistakable language saying that this is an absolute bastardization and perversion of Christianity, in the same way that the overwhelming majority of Muslim clerics have said Islamism is a perversion, a bastardization of the Muslim faith. It has no place anywhere in theological discussions. These people are heretics. They are the worst ambassadors for our faith ever. I mean, really uncompromising, clear, denouncing language. And I think that is absolutely what, frankly, it's not only in the United States, but many of you probably will guess from my accent, that's where I'm from. The idea that this is spreading like wildfire amongst, in particular, white Protestant evangelical churches, but not only, must be called out, because literally the soul of American Christianity, I think, is at risk. It is that serious. I feel like I've taken enough of everyone's time. I mean, if it comes up later, or I'm happy to address these, but I know that we're only supposed to be going for another hour. I really want to make sure that other speakers have time to, to address. And besides, these are hard theological questions. Come on, man. No, kidding.
No, you're right. Yeah, you're right.
About the others, and I'd be really grateful if we, could make sure that they have the same amount of time and chance to talk to others in the chat and in discussion.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's give Mathew our appreciation.
Thanks, everyone. You're very kind.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Let's take a 5-minute recess. So this is just a water, rehydrate, bathroom break. Then we'll come back with Aaron Woods doing the first presentation. So 5 minutes, and we'll see you all soon, okay? Great. Okay, so a couple housekeeping things. Number one, if you would like to donate to the Center for the Study of the Bible and Violence, we are accepting donations. If you want to Google CSBV and the word donate, it'll pop right up and you can donate there. And also, just a reminder, live tweet this if you want to with the hashtag CSBVCon21. Next, we got Aaron Wood presenting, and Aaron is a doctoral candidate at Asbury Theological Seminary, where he also serves as a Hebrew language instructor. Before coming to Asbury, Aaron spent a year teaching history and peace at a school primarily attended by Palestinians in East Jerusalem. His paper is entitled Jeremiah and Israel's New, Promised Land, reading Jeremiah 29 as a challenge to the new Christian Zionism. Thanks, Aaron, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Michael, and I appreciate the chance to share with you guys this paper. So I'll begin with an epigraph. All theology, knowingly or not, is by definition always engaged for or against the oppressed. Elizabeth Schussler of Fiorenza. Munther Isaac, a Christian Palestinian pastor, penned an open letter to U.S. Christians on May 19 of this year, 9 days into an 11-day artillery exchange between Israel and Hamas. In it, he calls on peacemakers to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but also to act, to, quote, discern what's really happening, call things by their names, then speak truth to power, end quote. For Munther and other Palestinian Christians, the desired outcome is plain. They wish to live with their Jewish neighbors in a just peace. But this harmony has been fractured by Western Christian theology, which disregards Palestinian Christians and has, quote, been part of the matrix that empowers the Israeli occupation, end quote. A similar sentiment is found in Mitri Raheb's book, Faith in the Face of Empire, where he notes that the United States and Europe continue to subsidize the Israeli occupation of Palestine by providing the hardware, military equipment, technology, and economic assistance, but also the software, the narrative, the theology, and the culture that continues to empower the state of Israel. While the current clashes in military hardware have quieted for now, the software continues to run and update it itself in many Christian communities around the world. One such update to this software is the recent book, The New Christian Zionism, Fresh Perspectives on Israel and the Land, edited by Gerald McDermott. In it, he brings together several scholars to contend for what he calls a new form of Christian Zionism. McDermott states that this new form of Christian Zionism is primarily new because it is not theologically dependent on dispensationalism. While this departure from dispensationalism seems to be the foremost reason this Christian Zionism is new, he further states that this form of Christian Zionism is also not merely nationalism, not merely Christian, not land theft, not racist, and it is not theocracy. To argue this case, McDermott attempts to reach further back in history and root the beginnings of Christian Zionism in the biblical witness of both Old and New Testament. The biblical witness for McDermott and its theological implications are the center of his argument. In this paper, I offer a challenge to that center and their narration of the Bible. I argue that this and other forms of Christian Zionism fail to take into account the Old and New Testament preference for diasporic existence after Jeremiah in the Babylonian exile. Jeremiah 29, which details Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, begins a shift, often called the Jeremianic turn, in Israel's mission away from a promised land only existence to a diasporic one. Further building on this turn, I suggest that Jeremiah's call to build, plant, and marry and seek the peace of Babylon has promised land implications for Israel. When Christian Zionism neglects this junction of the biblical narrative, it does not properly assess Israel's new paradigm for mission in the exile after Jeremiah's prophetic message. Finally, I end with some implications and offer some concluding thoughts. But first, I will briefly outline the new Christian Zionism in its narration of the Old Testament. So the new Christian Zionism. McDermott states that the best way to answer the question, what do we mean when we say the new Christian Zionism, is essentially the contents of his book. He then elucidates on a number of basic implications meant by the term, and these are quotes. The people and land of Israel are central to the story of the Bible. The Bible claims that God saves the world through Israel and the perfect Israelite. The history of salvation is ongoing. The people of Israel and their land continue to have theological significance. The return of the Jews from all over the world to their land and their efforts to establish a nation state after 2 millennia of being separated from controlling the land is part of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And lastly, Jews need and deserve a homeland in Israel, end quote. These underlying assumptions are not in any way new to forms of Christian Zionism, and thus the main new aspect here seems to be the absence of dispensationalism. Without defining Christian Zionism in specific terms, McDermott seems to identify any positions that anticipate a future Israel with the land, are eschatological or not, as Zionism. This broad definition gives McDermott permission to identify even the slightest positive statement concerning Israel as a modern state or an ancient people, and the land as a Zionist position in his retelling of Christian history. Robert O. Smith gives a more useful definition that encompasses this and older forms of Christian Zionism. He defines Christian Zionism as, quote, political action informed by specifically Christian commitments to promote or preserve Jewish control over the geographic area now comprising Israel and Palestine. It is these specifically Christian commitments that the new Zionism seeks to reinforce and defend. The question then arises, how do new Christian Zionists read the Old Testament as a basis for these Christian commitments? So new Christian Zionism and the Old Testament. Reflection on scripture is at the core of the new Christian Zionism's argument here, and I analyze the reflections on the Old Testament, its narrative, and its canonical context. McDermott offers his own biblical overview in the second chapter, where he attempts to read scripture as an argument for Christian Zionism. He fundamentally assumes the Old Testament is through and through a witness to Zionism. Several statements are made that assume the Old Testament is unquestionably Zionist. And by this, McDermott means, quote, that its primary focus is on a covenant with a particular people and land, both called Israel, and the land sometimes called Zion, end quote. He states that even anti-Zionists will concede that Zionism pervades the Old Testament, but then wrongly argue for a different vision in the New Testament. McDermott sees the vision of Christian Zionism as being, quote, rooted in the Hebrew Bible, where a covenant is the central story, and at the heart of the covenant is a promise of land. God takes the initiative to adopt a people and then to promise and eventually deliver a land to this people. God drove this people off their land twice, but even in the exile, his prophets declared that the land was still theirs. Thus, the staunch Zionism remains. McDermott understands the promised land can be lost. There are moral and religious conditions to residence in the land. Israel must be careful to keep the commandments of the Lord and their faithfulness to the covenant, or risk losing the land promised to them by God. Yet after the land was lost in exile, the prophets spoke of a day when Jews would return to the land from all over the world, beginning in Isaiah. The promise of return is continued through to Jeremiah, who states the exiles will return and, quote, dwell in their land, end quote. Zechariah also speaks of return, despite God being the one who scattered the people among the nations. But exile is not the end for landed Israel. McDermott states, quote, if possession of the land was never guaranteed, title to the land was, end quote. And he uses the above verses to argue that the land is still described as their own, even in the exile. McDermott makes a distinction here between the unconditional covenant made to Abraham that promises the land and the conditional Mosaic covenant, which stipulated, quote, that enjoyment of the land and other blessings was conditioned upon Israel's obedience, end quote. Thus, even if Israel loses the land, the unconditional covenant to Abraham still stands. Even when the prophets discuss an expanded vision of redemption, not just for Israel, but the entire world, their expansion does not abrogate the earlier promise that Israel would be gathered back to the land of Palestine. In Ezra and Nehemiah, some of the scattered people are brought back to the land, but for McDermott, this is not a fulfillment of the prophesied return. Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament still await a future return to the land. The criticism of the new Christian Zionism. My main criticism of Christian Zionism here is that it fails to appropriately incorporate the meaning of exile and Israel's normative diasporic existence into its biblical narration. It does not do justice to the full scope of the canonical story. Within the Old Testament itself are strong critiques of Zion theology and direct challenges to Israel's eternal claim on the Promised Land, which are largely ignored by Christian Zionists. By focusing so narrowly on the promise of land in the biblical covenants to Abraham and Moses, the land seemingly becomes the sole element of that promise, which is then constantly reaffirmed and unchallenged in their telling of the narrative of the Old Testament and its New Testament continuation. When God speaks to Abraham in Genesis 12, the promised land is only one of a fourfold dimension of the covenant promise. God promises to give Abraham and his descendants posterity, a privileged relationship with God, a promised land to dwell in, and a purpose, which is to be a blessing to all nations. Narrowing the focus of the patriarchal promise to just the land distorts the vision of God's redeeming mission to the world through a set-apart people who bear witness to God's way of life in a specific place. Thus, while land is initially a vital part of the promise to Abraham, it is not the only one. The understanding of Israel's connection to the land fundamentally changes after the exile. The hope for land restoration ultimately becomes an eschatological restoration, which will be done by the Messiah and only the Messiah. This is where McDermott's arguments fall short. They do not articulate the eschatological context of the return depicted in the prophets. Although he is careful to argue the return of a modern Jewish state called Israel is only a partial fulfillment, this misrepresents the prophetic message that this restoration is eschatological in nature. And the Messiah alone will regather the people into the New Jerusalem. A proper understanding of the new mission for Israel after Jeremiah and the turn away from promised land only existence to diaspora offers a corrective. So now I move to the Jeremianic turn. Christian Zionism rises and falls based on the correct canonical reading that is comprehensive, congruent, consistent, and cohesive. It is especially important to trace the proper developments in the narrative. One such development is the exile and Jeremiah's ministry in it. In the days of Jeremiah's ministry at the end of the 7th century, Judah was a vassal state to Assyria. The kings in Judah vacillated between loyalty to the next ruler, Babylon, and their adversary, Egypt. Should they call to Egypt in revolt or maintain vassalage to Babylon? It was because of these revolts that eventually Babylon destroyed the city of Zion and exiled its inhabitants on multiple occasions. Factions grew among the people of Judah concerning the best course of action and are described in Jeremiah 27 through 29. Cooperate with Babylon and avoid sure destruction, the message of Jeremiah in chapter 27, or revolt and trust in the inviolability of Zion, message of Jeremiah's prophetic opponent, Hananiah, in chapter 28. Throughout his ministry, Jeremiah's message challenged this dichotomy and asserted that God was on the side of the Babylonians, bringing judgment to Judah for disobedience. And after the first exile of elites in 597, Jeremiah sends a letter to the exiles where he calls for the exiles to settle in the land and seek the peace of the city. The pertinent section of the letter, which most scholars undeniably attribute to the prophet Jeremiah, are verses 4 through 7. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. While it may not seem like a radical shift in the promise and mission of God's people, Jeremiah calls the people to embrace diasporic living. This initial shift to residing in the diaspora has been labeled the Jeremianic turn in the writings of John Howard Yoder, among several other scholars. The message of Jeremiah turns the tide of Israel's history to understand exile and diaspora, not just as punishment, but as a new calling in their history. It is a decisive break from a promised land only existence in the power structures of the monarchical state. Undoubtedly, the prophet Jeremiah in his own time did not envision such a drastic shift in Israel's history. His continual calls for an eventual return after 70 years betray this understanding. However, when Jeremiah 29 is read in the wider scriptural tradition with a canonical directional reading, the letter becomes an initial embrace of diasporic existence and mission. The call to seek the salvation of the city where God sent them represented a new phase of mission and identity reorientation. This new diasporic identity became a new paradigm for Jewish thinking and living in exile. While it may seem initially difficult to link all the elements of this shift to Jeremiah's thought and time, when one traces the diasporic existence of later Jews backwards, Jeremiah 29 emerges as a catalyst for embracing not just exile, but diaspora as a new mode of living and calling. The new social shape of Jews in exile brought a strong shift from being a people of the city, Jerusalem, or of the soil, Palestine, to being a people of the book, Torah. Thus, when Nebuchadnezzar exiles the people of Jerusalem, the storyline shifts from Jerusalem to Babylon. The cultural and economic center of Judaism remained in Babylon thereafter. Rabbis as early as the 2nd century read this historical reality as God's fulfillment of Jeremiah's message to accept a non-sovereign, non-territorial self-definition. God had brought the people into exile, and it will be God alone who will bring them back. So now I'm turning to Deuteronomic allusions and the new promised land. The imperatives in Jeremiah's letter to the exiles are clearly understandable on the surface. Building houses, planting gardens, marrying, and begetting children is the language of settling down. But a surface reading cuts short Jeremiah's rhetorical prowess. The words of Jeremiah here have both immediate consequence and long-term implications. Many commentators have already noted the apparent connections between Deuteronomy and Jeremiah. Adele Berlin and Daniel Smith Christopher have argued more specifically that Jeremiah 29, 5-7 contains allusions to Deuteronomy 20, 5-10, which is a text that prohibits anyone from engaging in warfare who has recently built a house, planted a vineyard, or become engaged to a woman should they die and another enjoy them. These are the exact commands of Jeremiah in the exact order: build, plant, marry, and seek the peace of the city. The first action offered when approaching a city for battle in Deuteronomy 20, verse 10. Thus, when Jeremiah 29 is read in light of Deuteronomy 20, there is more to Jeremiah's letter than superficial advice to settle down. Here, Berlin affirms Jeremiah's clever rhetoric. She suggests that on one level, Jeremiah is instructing the Jerusalemites to settle down in Babylon. And on a deeper level, he is invoking the prohibitions against participating in holy war from Deuteronomy 20 to counsel against such revolts. Whereas Deuteronomy wanted to ensure that the promised land life would be enjoyed without being cut short, Jeremiah wants these promised land activities to begin in the foreign land of Babylon, with the added connotation of barring those who do such activities from participating in warfare against Babylon. Jeremiah is explicitly prohibiting militarized revolt. He further encourages the exiles to seek the peace of the city and find their own well-being in it. Their hope and well-being are then tied together with the city where God has exiled them. This is surely a radical change in the sociological and theological makeup of the people of Israel. There is yet further radical sense that in Jeremiah's message to the exiles that is precipitated by the commands in 29, 5-7. While Berlin and Smith Christopher draw attention to the immediate consequence, I argue that the long-term implications of these commands impact Israel's narrow definition of promised land. The reason these three activities exclude one from participating in warfare is because these things are part of the blessing of living in the promised land, the main business of life, as Berlin calls it. Building, planting, and marrying echo several Old Testament texts which speak about life in the promised land. These activities signify the Lord's blessing on the people in the land. Therefore, to begin to build a house, plant a vineyard, or marry and not be able to enjoy one's labor, fruit, or spouse oppose the Lord's purposes for life in the promised land. These are therefore promised land specific activities. Deuteronomy 28 also refers to the triad of promised land activities in the blessings and curses of the covenant. If Israel obeys the Lord, they will be blessed in their building, their planting, and their marrying, which also included the bearing of children. However, the reverse will occur if Israel is disobedient. Thus, for Jeremiah to suggest such activities to continue in the exile suggests these promised land blessings can and should take place on foreign soil. The blessings of the Lord are no longer directly connected to being a landed people in a specific area. The Lord can bless the people even outside of Jerusalem. The directives to the exiles then have an added layer of meaning. Jeremiah suggests that promised land life, building, planting, marrying, and begetting children can take place in Babylon. He encourages the exiles to live now as they did in their new promised land. Babylon also replaces Jerusalem as the place that the people are to pray to and seek its peace. The action of praying for Babylon would have been seen as a radical message for Jeremiah to communicate to the exiles. Prayers for the city of Jerusalem, according to Psalm 122, include prayers for peace within the city's walls and security within its towers. Jeremiah replaces Jerusalem as the object of prayer with Babylon. The meaning of such a replacement was surely bewildering, yet it is undeniably the case that Jeremiah proscribed blessed promised land activities on foreign soil. Surely this is a radical theological and political turn from Israel's previous existence up to that point. So my conclusion. In this paper, I've offered a challenge to the new and old forms of Christian Zionism, and its telling of the Old Testament story. While largely ignoring the significance of the exile event, the new Christian Zionists do not consider the radical change in Israel's history that takes place in and after the work of Jeremiah, specifically his letter to the exiles. His commands to build, plant, and marry, and seek the peace of Babylon represent a significant turn away from landedness to an initial embrace of diasporic living. The implications of Jeremiah's command to engage in promised land activities in Babylon seem to have radically redefined what promised land means for the people of God after the exile. And it is this diasporic status that the New Testament confirms and continues. If, as I have argued for, Jeremiah has radically redefined the promised land to include Babylon, therefore, Christians must reanalyze the entire Christian Zionist enterprise and its claims that Christians have a responsibility to support and even defend the modern state of Israel. This is not supported by the biblical text. The witness of the Bible is clear. Israel's promise of the land has been radically changed and its mission enhanced to better bless all nations by bearing witness to God's way of life in all nations on earth, a mission and a people that Christians have been grafted into because of the work of Jesus, the Messiah. Let us not forego that mission by narrow ties to provincialism or empire. May we heed the call of our Christian sisters and brothers from Palestine to promote a just peace in the land today. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So here's my kind of kicking off question, and for everybody else, remember, type in your questions in the chat box, and I'll field them. All right. So first question that I've from me is, how does in terms of Israel's story, you're arguing that the Babylonian exile and Jeremiah's spin on it is there's some new development within the landedness of the covenant of Israel. The question I have is how does what about like the wilderness wandering? So post-Egypt deliverance, wilderness wandering. Having recently been reading Ezekiel, it's interesting how this other prophet kind of idealizes and romanticizes the wilderness wandering period. And it seems like that's whether, at least maybe for Ezekiel, where he's drawing some of his direction for a constructive route forward for him and his diasporic Jews. I'm just curious how the wilderness wandering fits into this model that you're talking about, where there's evolution, as it were, that takes place within the covenant, but maybe is foreshadowed earlier with the wandering.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Definitely in the communities after the exile, this wilderness wandering becomes really important. As you mentioned in Ezekiel, I mean, one of the main points of the book is to say, with his visions, that God has wheels and wheels and wheels and can come with us, that God is going with us wherever we're going. So I do think it becomes a very important part of the story. And even in later Jewish communities, like in the Essene communities, and the Dead Sea communities, this kind of wilderness wandering kind of becomes a call for them. They see themselves as a sort of, as a continuation of kind of that wilderness wandering, and that God is still with them there. Yeah, that's a very good metaphor.
Okay, thanks. So we got a couple other questions. One from Kristen Kainer is about the connection of what Jeremiah is doing with the Babylonian Promised Land, Babylon Promised Land motifs and the promises in Joshua 1:4, which I'll read to you real quick because I don't remember what Joshua 1:4 says. Never attain for holding stretches that go all the way to the Euphrates, which essentially, yeah, that's the thing in Joshua 1:4 is that the land of Israel will go so far as the Euphrates. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important question. I mean, I don't want to in any way, say that the Israelites did not understand that the promised land was where they were to live out God's mission. I mean, that's very clear from Genesis 12 and onward, that God is going to lead these people to a specific place and give them this land. And then they're to live out what that looks like, what life under Yahweh reign looks like there. They're to live like that there. And so, the conquest is a part of that. But I think as you continue on through the story, you sort of get this deconquest. You get this, and I think as you track the story, you begin to see this. So the ideal vision of Israel in the land is the 12 tribes, right? But then Israel says, we want a king like the nations, and God is at first, this is God understands this is the direct rejection of his lordship. And so I think another way of kind of understanding this is as the story goes forward, God then breaks the people of that tight hold to the monarchy and a tight hold to the land because they've abused it. They've misunderstood what their mission was. They've gotten lost along the way. So I don't want to in any way deny those texts, have bold claims in Joshua and Judges. But as you read the story going forward, that the story then shifts. Instead of kind of centering in one place, you get this kind of scattering outwards. And I think that begins initially with Jeremiah.
Okay. Regarding N.T. Wright's notion of the end of exile happening in the Christ event, do you think that, what do you think about that proposal?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with that specifically, but I can speak to kind of diaspora versus exile. I mean, an exiled people sort of assumes, a homeland, assumes a place to go back to, versus what some of the scholars who work with the Germanic turn are kind of calling for is actually the preferred language is diaspora. I mean, that's what we see in the New Testament. In James and Peter, they use this language of dispersion, the scattered peoples, where they're no longer exiles who are longing to go back to one place, but they are a scattered people. And this is no longer a punishment, but this is a mission. This is a form of mission. Instead of the nations coming to one place, to the people of God are scattered all over the world.
Thank you. We're gonna have one more question. I'll see if I can summarize it well. Regarding, how do you think Amos 9:11 through 15, I might have to Google that one, is connected with the settlement text you mentioned in Jeremiah 29 and Deuteronomy 20? Do you need me to?
Yeah, that's the restoration of the, David's, the fallen shelter there. I do think, when you have texts like this, and there are many texts that talk about a desire to return, and that, God will plant, Israel back in their own land, never to be, kind of brought up or again. And I think, the way that these are understood as a Christian, especially after the Christ event, is that these are understood to be eschatological texts. And I think they would have been largely understood that way as well. Is the hope for the Messiah is going to be to bring Israel back. But I think when Jesus as the Messiah comes, he kind of explodes this idea and says, the desire to return is going to change drastically with the Christ event. So, I mean, there are many more texts like Amos 9:11 through 15 texts that talk about restoration. And I understand those after Christ as eschatological. Those are like Revelation 21 and so forth. Jerusalem and the land of Israel do maintain really strong symbolism, and they're very important things that are not just completely disregarded, but they place they have a place in the story, but it becomes like radically different after Jeremiah and the lead into the diaspora.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it very much. Okay, next we've got Louis Ndekha, Louis is going to give the second, well, I guess the third paper today. Dr. Louis Ndekha earned his PhD in New Testament at the University of Gloucestershire. He is a lecturer in biblical studies at the University of Malawi. There we go. University of Malawi, and a minister in the African Evangelical Church in Malawi. His paper is entitled "Loving the Enemy and Mob Justice in Malawi: A Contextual Reading of Luke 6:27 through 29." Thanks, Louis.
Oh, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction. Yeah. Thank you for having me this evening, all the way from Malawi. The title of my presentation this night is "Loving the Enemy and Mob Justice in Malawi: A Contextual Reading of Luke 6:27 to 29." Just by way of introduction, mob justice has recently become one of the recurring expressions of community violence in Africa. Studies of policing in African urban areas demonstrates rising levels of mob justice. A recent study of policing in Cameroon, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and South Africa has indicated the increasing incidences of mob justice. And the rate of fatalities in these incidences are quite alarming. For example, between 2006 and between 2000 and 2004, in one city in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, 1,249 people actually died out of mob justice. That translated to about 320 individuals lost to mob justice every year in one city. Malawi recently has also experienced lots of incidences of mob justice. And what is interesting about the situation of Malawi is that Malawi is a demographically Christian nation with about 80% of the population being Christian. However, in spite of this conspicuous presence of religious consciousness, it looks like mob justice seems to be on the rise. For example, in 2019, between January and November, police records recorded 86 fatalities in the southern part of Malawi. And according to a police constable, he says that the geographical distribution of the mob violence in the country seems to show that the practice has become a widespread acceptance as a norm. He laments, and I quote, "It is quite disheartening to note that violence is so normalized in our society to the extent that ordinary people commit horrific acts in response to various crimes without remorse." Now, this paper attempts to explore the contextual meaning of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in the Malawian context. And the exploration is done within the context of the growing incidences of mob justice, especially for those who are accused of theft or witchcraft, especially the elderly women and children. The argument of the paper is that in a country with over 80% of the population being Christian, the increasing cases of mob justice towards those perceived to be on the wrong side of the law begs the question of the relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in this largely Christian nation. Now, I want to contend that understanding the context of of Luke's primary audience. When the text of Luke 6:27-29 is understood within the context of Luke's primary audience, Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy and his corollary instructions in verses 28-29 provided a framework for early Christianity's response to violence. Such an approach to understanding the love of the enemy has significant relevance to contemporary discussion on Christian response to mob violence in Malawi. A number of studies have been done on mob justice in Africa, and Malawi in particular. The majority of these studies have been done from ethnographical and anthropological perspective. However, in a religiously saturated country like Malawi, theological perspectives on mob justice remain scant. This paper attempts to fill that gap. It intends to ignite a theological discussion on mob justice that will set in motion a popular conversation on Christian involvement in mob justice. And the paper basically has 3 sections. In the first section, I offer the methodology and the hypothesis of the study. In the second part, I discuss issues of mob justice in Malawi within the context of collective moral agency and the community's representation of the offender as the enemy. In the third section, I offer a brief reading of Luke 6, verses 27-29, from the perspective of mob justice. Now, in terms of approach, the paper is interdisciplinary. It combines a study of Malawian reception of Jesus' command to love the enemy in Luke 6:27-29, and a contextual exegesis of the same within the context of mob justice. Now, part of the research is based on a survey of a Christian understanding of Jesus' command to love the enemy against the background of mob justice in Malawi. A sample of 30 Christians across the different Christian traditions were interviewed in southern Malawi. And the criteria for inclusion into the sample was twofold. Christian commitment measured through active participation in Bible studies and regular attendance at church. And secondly, a history of involvement in or support for mob justice in a community context. The paper's theoretical framework is informed by Magdalene Chulek's recent analysis of the role of collective agency in the reproduction of mob justice in a Kenyan context. In our paper, Mob Justice and Everyday Life, the role of Nairobi, the case of Nairobi's Kibera and Kogorocho slums, she analyzed the function of mob justice in impoverished areas of Nairobi. She concludes that the mob justice serves an integrative function. Not only does it create community cohesion, but also acts as a reference point for the community's sense of order. According to her, underlying mob justice is a community's representation of the victim as the enemy. This suggests that the quest for preservation and the maintenance of social order leads the community to regard the offender as the other, the outsider, who has to be eliminated. A religious dimension to Chulek's thesis is offered by Richard Shellington's metaphysical analysis of mob justice in a Tanzanian context. In his 2007 paper, Shellington observed that mob justice in a community context is performed not only to punish and teach the criminals, but also to depersonalize them through an essentialist social-religious discourse that constructs them as antisocial beings with corrupted souls. Now, the difference between Chulek's and Shellington's analysis here is at the point at which representation as enemy or depersonalization takes place. For Chulek, identification as enemy provides the basis for mob justice, while for Shellington, depersonalization is a result of mob justice. I would say the strength of Shellington's analysis which is very important for this paper, is its ability to provide a social-religious dimension to mob justice. His position is supported by the entrenched nature of religious consciousness in Africa, which makes violence to be intricately interwoven within the communal religious fabric. At the same time, although the Bible has significant influence on African public morality, due to its ambiguous attitude to violence, its role in the intensification or mitigation of violence is always perilous. The above analysis not only provides useful insights into the dynamics of violence in community contexts, but also the relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy and its implications for understanding violence in a Christian community. Now, while Sholek and Sherrington's methodologies are primarily ethnographic, this paper locates the community's othering and representation of the victims of mob justice as the enemy within a theological context. It argues that the community's construction of the offender as the enemy and subsequent violence on them, when understood within the majority Christian communities, where the Bible is a significant source of public morality, raises the question of the reception of and relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in Luke 6, verses 27 to 29. The paper therefore attempts to read Jesus' love command in the context of mob justice in Malawi. Through this reading, it hopes to contribute to the emerging theologies of violence in Africa. An interesting angle to mob violence in Malawi is the religious dimension that the phenomena manifests. There are two ways of understanding religious elements of mob justice in Malawi. First of all, as I said before, 80% of the country's population are Christians who take the Bible seriously as the word of God. And this suggests that the majority of all those involved in mob justice are Christians. Now, this hypothesis is supported by the results of the survey that was part of the study. The respondents in the survey that was done as part of this paper showed that most of the respondents regularly read the Bible, and they were involved in Bible studies, and they were committed to the authority and the value of the Bible as the word of God. However, over 70% of the respondents demonstrated awareness of Jesus' teaching on the love of the enemy in Luke 6:27. Some of them, about 30%, had preached from or read the Bible from or led Bible studies from the text of the sermon on the plain, and specifically on the love command. Over 50% of the respondents had heard the text of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in a worship context. Yet in the context where community norms were perceived to have been violated, 70% of the respondents said they did participate in mob justice and were ready to do it again. 30% of the respondents, while not directly involved in mob violence, were in support of it. It is also interesting, again, to note that 90% of the respondents acknowledge that the victims of mob justice are not always complete strangers. They are usually members of the same community. Their acts of theft or perceived witchcraft are deemed to be contrary to community values and therefore amenable to violence. Now, 80% of the respondents in the study had varied reasons for similar reasons for their participation in mob justice. For example, for most of them, a strong connection with the injured party was a motivation for involvement in mob justice, even though they were aware of what Jesus says in Luke 6. Again, this nearness to the injured party would be members of the immediate family or members of the immediate community. especially where the offender can be classified as not having strong ties with the community. Others were concerned with the preservation of community values. The need to stamp out on social behavior drove them to participate in mob justice. In that way, they were helping to create a just society. That's what they claimed. About 60% of the respondents used the example of Jesus turning of the table of money lenders to justify their involvement in mob justice. Thus, while they are aware of Jesus' command to love the enemy, in a specific context, they explain their case by referring to Jesus' use of violence. Some of the respondents felt that mob justice, especially if it teaches a lesson to the offender, serves as a correctional service, especially in situations where the legal system does not function properly. They argued that where the victim dies without learning the lesson, they said the intention is not to kill, but to teach a lesson. And for most of the death, if somebody dies, the death is not the intended consequence of mob justice. So if somebody dies, it's not like they were planning for him to die, but he died as an intended consequence. Now, two issues can be highlighted from the survey. The first one is the commitment to root out social deviance in the community, which for most of the respondents was the basis of their participation in mob violence. It follows that if the removal of social deviance involves the death of the offender, it demonstrates the community's identification and the representation of the offender as the enemy to be eliminated. This understanding agrees with Juleck's analysis that the death of the victim of mob violence is determined by the community's representation of him or her as the enemy. Thus, the visibility of the community's action becomes symbolic of the community's stance, becomes symbolic of what the community stands for. Secondly, from this survey, it can be observed that Jesus' command to love the enemy is either rationalized or ignored altogether in context of mob justice. This rationalization explains why, in some cases, mob justice originates in religious context. For example, in a recent incident, a mob justice phenomena was triggered by a prophet, a church leader, who allegedly claimed that a missing boy was being kept in the rich neighbor's village nearby. This led the community to vandalize the businessman's property. Further, there are a number of instances where children and elderly are accused of witchcraft, but the context of the accusation originates from church context. For example, it is normally the practice that in situations of unexplained deaths, communities try to seek answers from religious leaders or witch doctors. Most of the time, the traditional or the religious leaders or the traditional doctors, their post-mortem of the death always points to something, to individuals as the source of or the cause of the problem. Now, in a recent study, Erwin van der Meyer, in a paper titled "Witchcraft Accusation in Malawi," he identifies the religious origins of mob justice among Pentecostal and charismatic pastors and prophets. His argument is that the Pentecostal and charismatic approach to evil provides, especially the personalized nature of evil and the need to stamp out evil in the community, provides a context for mob justice. Again, he also attributes the influence of Nigerian movies with which depicts witchcraft and malevolent spirit as a primary cause of misfortune and death in African communities as being responsible for mob justice in Malawi. Now, the relationship between Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality and mob justice is possible given the movement's emphasis on evil powers. Such spiritual powers are usually understood as embedded in malevolent individuals in the community. When combined with the endemic fear of witchcraft in Africa, such conception of evil provides a religious dimension to mob justice. This demonstrates that not only this demonstrates the dimensions, the different dimensions of mob justice, but also the complex relationship between Christianity and violence. Again, when we think about the promotion and participation of Christian communities in mob justice, it raises the question of the uniqueness of the Christian community from the rest of the population. Now, for me, I believe that this calls for the development of a hermeneutic that would address the current challenges of mob justice in Malawi. As Otmar Fax has argued, there is need for the formulation of a hermeneutic that would help individuals to use violent texts in the Bible without producing new violence. In a Malawian context, such a hermeneutic should also help Christian communities to engage with the texts that promote a spirit of non-violence. This paper argues that among the texts among the biblical texts, Luke 6 verses 27 to 29, its emphasis on the love of enemy provides a starting point for a discussion of mob justice from a theological perspective in Malawi. Now, I want to attempt to provide a rationale for using Luke 6 as a basis for issues of mob violence in Malawi. It must be acknowledged that using the Bible to deal with the issues of violence presents its own challenges. Among these challenges is the Bible's ambiguous reference to violence. Its apparent promotion and censorship of violence presents hermeneutical complexity in many instances. For example, as Jeremy Pont has argued recently, while the New Testament promotes peace, such advocacy, when understood within the context of the sometimes exclusive language of the New Testament text, such advocacy stands side by side with tolerance and even promotion of violence. However, we must know that while we accept the Bible's ambiguous relationship with violence, we also take into cognizance the historical role of biblical texts in the formation of Christian ethics. And again, my proposal is that the singular use of Jesus' exhortation may also need to be put into perspective. We know that Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy is found in Matthew 5:43 and 48 and Luke 6:27 to 36. However, Luke's version is not only unique, but also plays a critical role in Jesus' sermon's exhortation in the Sermon on the Plain, in the third gospel. In the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus makes the love command the remedy for dealing with systemic reciprocity within the community. Matthew's version, on the other hand, presents the love command as part of a series of antitheses without any critical role in the sermon structure. It can be observed that from verse 27 of Luke 6, Jesus shifts his focus from his disciples to the rest of the audience. This dramatic shift in the audience is conspicuously absent in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew presents a seamless transition from the Beatitudes into the exhortation, suggesting a unitary audience. However, in the shift in verse 27a in Luke's Gospel, from the disciples to all those who are hearing, has implications for understanding the sermon's significance for Luke's primary audience. At a basic level, the shift implies Jesus' interest beyond the disciples, as commissioned in Luke 6:13. This suggests that for Luke's gospel, the sermon's message was directed not only at his disciples, but also at the immediate Madishus, including any other communities, like the Malawian communities, who would have access to the third gospel's text. This makes Luke's text the most relevant text for starting a conversation on mob justice in Malawi. Now, one of the reasons the author of Luke's Gospel wrote his gospel was for Theophilus and his fellow converts to know the certainty of what they had been taught. One aspect of this as failure or certainty was probably his, to help Theophilus understand the implications of Jesus' ethical and practical directives on interpersonal relationships. This interpersonal emphasis becomes apparent in Jesus' express command to love the enemy in Luke 6, verses 6 to 6. I mean, Luke 6, 27 to 36. While the pericope from 27 to 36 reflects the love command in general, verses 29 and to 27 are more distinct from verses 30 to 36. The former reflects more social issues, while the latter is more economic in nature. It is also important to note that outright violence may not have been the immediate context of the love command in Luke. From the gospel's preoccupation with poverty, it is likely that social differences, especially between the poor and the rich, provided the saying's immediate context. Richard Horsley, years ago, argued that the use of Jesus' love the enemy as sayings in relation to non-violence against a foreign enemy is a failure to appreciate the contextual nature of the sayings and their significance in their original context. He then argues that the sayings were contextual in nature and were meant to address issues of indebtedness of members within the Christian communities and the gospel writers. So such indebtedness probably arose out of Greco-Roman exploitative taxation systems that left the peasants groups at the mercy of creditors. In this paper, I want to agree with Horsley's location of the love command in a community context. However, unlike Horsley, who denies the nonviolent import of the text, we want to argue that Luke 6:27, when read together with the reference to turning the other cheek, envisaged in the next two verses, has implications for understanding the place of mob justice within any other Christian community, including the Malawian community. Now, the nature of the community nature of the love command, which Horsley advocates, is also supported by a number of lexical analysis, which demonstrates a particularized understanding of this text, which would be relevant for a study, which would be relevant for application in the Malawian context. For example, although generally translated as enemy, the word ecthros, love, the word ecthros, enemy, used in Luke 6:27, although generally translated as enemy, the term has nuances that demonstrate hostility among people who know each other, which has relevance to what is happening in the Malawian context, where mob justice takes place within a particular context among people who know each other. And the best way to establish this is to look at some lexical company that the word ecthros keeps within its context.
Lewis,
so basically,
just one more minute, okay?
Yeah, so basically, my argument is that when we talk about ecthros as an individual that somebody knows, but who is not in agreement with, that provides a context for understanding mob justice in Malawi context and its application and how we can address issues in a Malawi context. In that case, I believe Luke 6, verses 27 to 28 provides a good starting point for discussing mob justice in Malawi in a brief way. I think I'll address most of the issues in the questions section.
I have a feeling that we may have temporarily lost Michael. He dropped off my screen. Let me say thank you so much, Lewis. That was really, really interesting. And questions are flooding in. I'm a little bit concerned about time. I'm a little bit concerned about making sure that Maria gets her chance to present as well. I think what I'm inclined to suggest, pending Michael rejoining us, is that we're going to move straight on for now to Maria, and then perhaps we can have questions for both of you at the end of Maria's paper, if that's okay.
Right.
But thank you very much. That was really, really interesting, and yeah, a fascinating insight into a culture that's very different from that I'm familiar with. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm delighted then, let me just switch things around a little bit here. I'm delighted then to introduce Dr. Maria Power. Maria is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Human Justice at the Las Casas Institute in Oxford University. She's a Catholic social historian. And because I wasn't expecting to introduce her, I don't have her paper title in front of me. So I'm going to ask Maria, sorry, to introduce your own paper title. I beg your pardon. But thank you very much, Maria.
Okay, thanks. So my paper is, which was suggested before the riots, I would like to add, Overcoming Conflict-Generating Interpretations of the Bible, Some Lessons from Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has been much in the news recently, and as Mathew showed us, riots have once again erupted in the most deprived areas of the region, as many members of the Loyalist community, and for those of you who don't know, the Loyalists are the more hardline community who retain the strongest desire to remain part of the UK, and they were the ones that were probably the people that voted strongest for Brexit in the entire nation. Basically, these riots are a chance for them to vent their anger at the cavalier attitude of Boris Johnson's government to the border issue during the Brexit negotiations, which sent a clear message to unionists and the Loyalists that the rest of the United Kingdom is no longer interested in its fate. So it actually feels slightly strange offering lessons to people from a place that so many of its inhabitants feel as if it's a failed state. And just from talking to friends there and watching the news, knowing what's going on with the cronyism in political circles, it really is a failed state. And I don't use that language lightly. However, despite this, Northern Ireland does provide us with an excellent case study of Christians. And when I say Christians, I don't mean people that nominally say that they believe in the Christian faith, but people that do hold a deep Christian faith, are seeking to build peace and to combat the use of religious rhetoric as a means of generating polarization, which in the past has erupted in violence and which I think will erupt again in July. There's certain flashpoints in the year and July is one of them. And then later in the summer when the weather heats up, there'll be another flashpoint. So although the conflict in Northern Ireland is not religious, it's a conflict around socioeconomic issues and issues of sovereignty, the rhetoric used certainly was, especially within the Loyalist community. Now, the Bible has been central to this, and there are two main readings used to justify the continuation of violence and the maintenance of sectarian hatred or othering. So the first is the narrative of an exiled people based upon Exodus, seeking to do the will of God in a hostile land. So you'll see that Northern Irish Protestants equate themselves with with the Israelites and also with the Afrikaans people of South Africa. And if you wander around any Loyalist area of Belfast you will see Israeli flags flying. This has also led to the creation of a conflict-generating siege mentality within the Protestant community, which will be the issue that I will deal with in the paper. The second is the belief created from a reading of the book of Revelation that the end times are imminent. Such a discourse is most prevalent within the evangelical community. So the physical violence in Northern Ireland, the growth of ecumenism, and people on the more fundamentalist wing of Protestantism do still refer to Catholic churches as synagogues of Satan. And the growing middle class confidence within the Catholic community in Northern Ireland are all signs of a looming apocalypse from which the chosen few will be saved. You know, there's a reason that the Rapture novels are bestsellers in Northern Ireland. The result of this is an identification of God with nation, of God with Ulster, and a politicisation of belief, particularly within the evangelical community. Now, so why is the evangelical community in Northern Ireland so important? There's two reasons which have been shown very compellingly by the work of Gladys Ganior. First, they themselves constitute around 25% of the Protestant population, of the whole population in Northern Ireland. But secondly, the influence, and their theological influence in particular, reaches far beyond the boundaries or borders of evangelicalism themselves. And you can really see their influence on the kind of mainstream Anglican Church and mainstream Presbyterianism. Thus, any of the Irenic messages contained within the Bible during the conflict, and I would say even now, are overlooked in favour of interpretations that encourage the development and maintenance of boundaries, i.e. keeping Protestants and Catholics separate, and processes of othering. Such ideas were challenged by a myriad of organisations in Northern Ireland, but one in particular, the Evangelical Contribution in Northern Ireland, or ECONI, which now is the Centre for Contemporary Christianity in Northern Ireland, stands out as one which sought to speak to evangelicalism from within, and which aimed, quote, to address our fellow evangelicals in order to encourage a continuing process of relating the Bible to our confused situation, end quote. So this paper is going to examine the work of ECONI, showing that in order to prevent biblical texts from being used to stir up hatred and animosity, someone has to take the step of acting in a countercultural manner and engage in the self-criticism needed, i.e. identifying why this is wrong before seeking to create more positive attitudes to peace building and relationships with the other by deploying a different reading of the Bible. I'll just say that these people, I admire them greatly, and I hope that comes across, actually put themselves in physical danger by doing this. There were instances of faith-based peace builders being killed in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. So these people were engaging in something very courageous. And I think there's a great deal that we can learn now. So firstly, I just briefly want to talk about my methodology and positionality. So the material presented in this paper is based upon a series of interviews with this group of Northern Irish evangelicals. And they were a group of people who made an active decision to recognise the potential for peacemaking within their own religious tradition and act counterculturally to present this message in the public square. In doing so, they produced a series of publications, which in addition to the interviews, I also analysed, and the contents of which form the basis of my conclusions. I'd also like to take a moment to address my positionality. I approach this material as a Catholic ethicist who specialises in the ethics of peace building and whose research seeks to use the teachings of the gospel to overcome the structural violence that I believe is the root cause of the problem in Northern Ireland. I'm also a committed ecumenist and have worked in this area. I came across ECONI first whilst researching for my PhD on faith building, but have returned to their work with fresh eyes as a result of the engagements I've made through my involvement with the CSBV. So I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm briefly going to show you how they engaged in internal reflection and self-criticism. And then I'm going to kind of examine how their peacemaking practices sought to use the Bible as well. So the need to understand and challenge the problematic relationship between faith and politics within evangelicalism was the foundation stone of Ikonai's experience. As one of my interviewees said, quote, "There was a very real sense in which Protestant evangelicals had been relatively silent throughout the conflict, and also perhaps hadn't asked hard questions of itself." Thus, at its foundation in 1987, Ikonai underwent a period of self-reflection and self-criticism through which it examined evangelical identity through the prism of the Bible and reflected on the conflict-generating behaviour of evangelicals in Northern Ireland. One particular issue, as I've said before, the creation and maintenance of boundaries by the evangelical community, was constantly in evidence throughout this discourse. Ikonai argued that the arc mentality that many evangelicals subscribed to was central to the creation of such boundaries. These were the result of, quote, "evangelicalism's ambiguous relationship to the world beyond the confines of the church, which has meant that they have been particularly prone to creating enclaves isolated from significant interaction with the outside world." This observation of the phenomenon of boundary creation within the evangelical community prompted Ikonai to ask, for Ulster evangelicals, in the choice between faith and Ulster, was it God who had lost out? The resulting criticism contended that evangelical Christians had become separated from those around them, constructing barriers which were actually often physical, which prevented them from becoming contaminated by contact with those whom they believed to be in error, mostly Catholics, but also other members of the Protestant communion. This in turn led to, quote, "pride, which arises when this presumed special relationship leads the community to look down on or exclude those who are not part of the community, and so not part of that special relationship with God," quote, end quote. Ikonai's criticism of this behaviour was forceful, essentially arguing that through such boundaries, evangelicals completely avoided interaction with anyone they believed to be in error, thereby preventing peaceful relationships from being established. Because the first thing you have to do in building a relationship is actually talk to someone. Rigid interpretations of biblical texts and rules regarding behaviour led to further reinforcement of the boundaries. Quote, "Like the Pharisees, we set up certain criteria by which we assess whether others belong or not. In the process, like the Pharisees, we end up critical and judgmental of those who fail to meet our criteria, or we end up ignoring more important matters, or we end up adopting attitudes of hostility and suspicion towards wider society." The consequence was the formation of a society which, although was allegedly embedded with the ideals of the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, was one which was far removed from that created by Jesus when he crossed the sectarian barriers of his time through his engagement with Samaritans and his fellowship with the marginalized and shunned, or what N.T. Wright has called the moral equivalent of lepers. Ikonai argued that such attitudes were conflict generating as they created, quote, "an intimate relationship between God, land, and nation, whereby, on occasion, political and cultural positions were defended at the expense of biblical values and attitudes," end quote. Subsequently, boundaries manifested themselves through complacency and rigidity regarding the situation, both politically and socially, and a refusal, importantly, to contemplate the role played by individuals in its perpetuation. As a result, the identification of Christianity with a particular political outlook by both sides of the community has resulted in a serious loss of spiritual impact on the part of Christian believers. Instead of Christians being able to comment freely on the political order and to offer biblical insights, we often reflect the divisions in our society. As a result, we become part of the disease and are therefore unable to become part of the cure. Once again, boundaries were at the heart of this discourse. Quote, "We proclaim that we have set aside the idols of false religion, yet in their place we have established the idols of land and people." And you only have to wander around any part of Belfast, east or west, and you'll see the way that religious imagery is used to demarcate territory. And that's something that Helen and I are talking about working on. Political views were therefore, quote, "not passed through the prism of faith," further reinforcing notions of superiority. This was a distortion of the very tenets of evangelicalism. Quote, "Will we refuse to acknowledge our failings, to see how we have compromised the truth of God with our traditions, dishonored the name of God through our sin, stifled his word through our disobedience?" The importance of this process of self-reflection and criticism should not be underestimated, and it's something that Mathew emphasized earlier. In fact, I think it should be the start of any process which seeks to overcome the use of the Bible in polarization. We can only seek to understand conflict-generating readings of the Bible through a forensic understanding of their content and motivation. So obviously, it means having to speak to people that we might disagree with. So then what do we do once we've created this understanding of motivation and content? So for Ikonai, peace meant breaking down barriers and creating a vision of society based upon the teachings of Jesus. A person's faith should encompass every aspect of their life, public as well as private. This, it is argued, was the very essence of evangelicalism. Quote, "The church's ministry encompasses not only evangelism, not only social witness, but all of life. And that means that the church must be the salt in the political life of society." As it had shown, the balance between the political and the private had to be redressed within Northern Irish evangelicalism, especially in relationship to the conflict. Thus, the process of readjusting peacemaking practices was carried out in two stages. Firstly, Ikonai began by presenting a convincing argument that there was a need to engage with the community outside evangelicalism. It then provided biblical frameworks for use in peace-building practices. And one of the things I'm not going to talk about is the training programs that they ran and all the resources that they developed, which are still available archived on their website if any of you want to look at them. Ikonai wanted to overcome the perception that trying prayer simply as a method of securing peace was wrong. They weren't saying that you shouldn't pray, but they were saying that you want the prayer, as Dorothy Day tells us, needs to drive us off our knees and into action. It made its argument by employing the teachings of the Gospels and comparisons to Israeli covenantal experience as a starting point before contextualizing the material for Northern Ireland. Through this re-examination of Gospel teachings, Ikonai presented a new argument of evangelical engagement within society. It demonstrated that the example set by Jesus required that evangelicals as Christians become active rather than passive peacemakers, immersing themselves in society and crossing boundaries, as, quote, "every boundary drawn was a denial of their calling as the people of God." The main evidence for Ikonai's argument was an analysis of the behaviour of Jesus during his ministry. Quote, "Jesus proclaimed the need for a return to an authentic understanding of holiness that reflected the love and mercy of God. Not only did he proclaim this, but in his ministry he practiced it, breaking through the boundaries that had been established and challenging Israel to reflect both the holiness and mercy of God's love." Ikonai tested the key justifications put forward for evangelicals for their behaviour in Northern Ireland against the teachings of the gospel. It sought to answer the question, what kinds of holiness can we see among Christians in our community? The answers provided directly challenged the evangelical community and demonstrated how it was perpetuating the conflict. Ikonai advocated that Christianity was a society based upon love and inclusiveness. Failure to do anything but to love and include people was causing sectarianism. In the context of our conflict, different cultures and identities have become vehicles for sectarian division in which God is perceived to have favourites, and in particular cultural patterns and identities are seen to qualify or disqualify people from belonging to all or part of this island. Ikonai taught that the evangelical faith came with a mandate to connect with the other and actively work for peace. The only way for evangelicalism in Northern Ireland to retain its integrity was for its members to lose their individualistic and separatist tendencies and to engage with the world. With this in mind, it created a number of resources, and I see someone's asked me a question about that, so I won't talk about those. So to conclude, through its work, Ikonai created a model of engagement in the public square for the evangelical community in Northern Ireland. Its research officer summed up the premise behind its work as follows. It was about encouraging people to think about what it means to say that the Bible is authority in a society in conflict, what it means to think about the relationship of their Christian faith and their unionist identity, what contribution the churches have played, for better or for worse, in shaping the wider Protestant community, and what kinds of things Christians should be doing to constructively engage with community conflict. This approach was the key to Ikonai's achievement, as it clearly understood that the way to encourage evangelicals to engage in peace building and reconciliation was to actually provide them with considered approaches to the issues involved, based upon the central focus of their faith, the Bible. They didn't harangue them, they actually approached them with love as well. That's another point I just thought of. So, what lessons can we learn? There are two key words here for me. And I think these are words that all peace builders, and especially the people that engage in the diplomatic peace building or Peace Inc., need to know: understanding and patience. Ikonai established that all people needed to be engaged on their own terms when it came to dealing with peace and reconciliation. Thus, the organisation had to commence with a reflection upon the nature of evangelicalism by using language and examples that the community could relate to, such as the relationship of covenantal theology to the Northern Irish situation. It is also shown that success is not instantaneous. So we're 23 years on from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and Northern Irish society is nowhere near peaceful. The kinds of boundaries in place in Northern Ireland took years to build, and we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the state this month, I think, but will take even longer to dismantle. So patience is required. Furthermore, answers can only come from within the communities who are displaying the conflict generating behaviour. People like me can help and analyse and offer answers, but we can't go in saying exactly what we think people need. However, the work of this organisation does leave me with one substantial question. When we're seeking to engage with those who wish to polarise society, do we deal with the most moderate people, those that we perceive as the most moderate people first, and seek to work out? Or do we start with those on the margins and work inwards? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. I'm back. My internet went out. Oh wow, this was great. We're gonna do some Q&A for both Professor Lewis and Professor Maria. And so the first question for Maria, I'm interested in that last thing you had to say about it, as far as a strategy of working from the middle out versus the margins in. That's very fascinating to me. I'm curious if you could comment, say a little bit more about that.
Okay, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is this notion of getting to the grassroots. And I think that as Christians, we're perfectly, or people of faith, we're perfectly placed to do that, because we have organizations in place through different church structures. But one of the things that the kind of elite peace building processes has taught me is that you do actually need to talk to everyone. But what I'm trying to work out, and I've been wrestling in conversation with more real. I'm very much an idealist in terms of my perception of peace building. With more realist colleagues, is that they say that it's only when you get the people in the centre on board can you actually start to talk to people at the margins. Whereas I think that the people on the margins are the ones suffering the most pain and who are suffering the most, and that our vocation, or my vocation as a Christian ethicist, is to reach out to those who are suffering the most. And so I therefore argue that we need to talk to people on the margins, because they are the ones kind of howling out with the cries of pain, and they are the ones that are in effect being used and manipulated by these people who are, I was going to say an Irish swear word there, but I won't. Who are?
That's unfortunate.
Pardon? I won't.
No, keep going.
Who are? I'll reuse the word manipulating the Bible, and manipulating the fears of these people to their own ends. So it's something that I'm wrestling with, and if anybody else has any answers, I would love to hear them, or I would love to enter into dialogue with people about it. I really, really would.
That's fascinating. Could I throw a question towards Professor Ndekha? The question is, to what degree might one consider the dynamic of retributive justice inherent in the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonements, which I guess I would suppose is popular given the kind of broadly Pentecostal framework that was mentioned. So how does that kind of retributive justice model that's has a very dense theological weight to it, how does that contribute to valorizing mob violence in Malawi away from, say, restorative justice, if those two things can be proposed?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when you look at the religious landscape in Malawi, there are all different traditions. We have the traditional churches, Catholics, Presbyterians. Then we have the new churches. I think the Pentecostal and the Charismatics. The whole question of theological discourse, serious theological discourse, doesn't seem to be prevalent within the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement. They're more practical. They're not very theological. They're more pragmatic, or shall we say? So when the issues of the influence of doctrine on Christian practice, especially in terms of influencing the whole subconscious of a people group, I think it's very, very minimal. What I find is a more emphasis on understanding evil within the Pentecostal and Charismatic, evil as embodied in individuals, and then how that is supposed to be stamped out using miracles or prophecies. So nothing very deep, but more practical. And I think it feeds on the whole cultural ethos of witchcraft and fear of witchcraft, as well as feeding on the whole failed legal system, where the justice system is not only slow, but also almost very inefficient. So yeah, while there's a little bit of theology behind the activities, but I think it's a combination of the pragmatism within the Pentecostal and Charismatic movements, and more of the cultural ethos of African cultural ethos, which which I think emphasize fear of witchcraft. So there's this issue of theft or witchcraft accusations are being the basis or the major factors within the context of mob justice. So I wouldn't attribute any deep theology behind that. Really, it's more pragmatic. And the major challenge will be the silence of the larger Christian community in the mob violence, and the fact that even within the discourse of aversion or preventing mob justice, the Bible is never used. It's the police and other human rights people talking about it, but the Christian community is always quiet and almost complicit in the practice.
Wow, so we are over time, so we're gonna have to, unfortunately, not do any more questions, but I could stay for another hour and keep digging in. This has been really 4 very, very good, excellent papers, and we want to show our appreciation and thanks to all of you. Very good, thank you. Real briefly, I want to say this is day 1 out of a multi-day conference that's going to be going all week. Tomorrow, we are doing, the start time is going to be noon, Bristol, England time. Google it yourself, your own time zone to translate. Oh, great. Yeah. So yeah, excellent. Be ready if you can make it tomorrow at noon. We're going to be having sessions on global scholarship on the Bible and violence, and very excited about that. The rest of the week as well, I think, Helen, the rest of the week is all starting at 7 o'clock Bristol time. Is that correct?
Yes, so the one session tomorrow at midday, particularly aimed at majority world scholars, although of course we're welcoming scholars from everywhere all week. And then every day for the rest of the week, including tomorrow, we have a session at 7 p.m. as well.
Excellent. I also wanted to mention that, and we'll tag the website for the Center for the Study of the Bible and Violence in the chat. But at the website, you can, we've got a lot of resources that are being put out there. We have a new blog that is great. What was it? Sunday sermons, Monday morning? Morning being spelled.
Yeah, so we've got
morning, not. We've got a podcast that Maria and I are heading up. And then we also have a new journal, the Journal for the Study of the Bible and Violence, JSBV. Be looking for all that. Helen and I have a plan for the session papers to have a future in publication, so stay tuned there. And I think that is all I have to say. Is there anything else, Helen, before we wrap up?
No, just a huge thank you to everyone for coming, and especially, of course, for our 4 fantastic presenters.